I hope everyone is doing well in this new semester. We are continuing the series that we started in the fall. We had free talks, and we are also going to have free talks in the spring. Our next event will be with Sarah Beckwith on February 26th. We'll have another talk in April 16th with Ranji Khanna. You will get information about these two talks. Our colleague Charlotte Sussman will give the Langford lecture in March. I believe it's on the 26th of March. So some of you, I hope, will join us for that event as well. People are still signing in, so I think we'll wait just another minute and then we'll get started. As always, I want to thank Quante for helping us set up the event. He's doing all this work of signing up everybody and making sure everything is running smoothly. So thank you, Quante. So people are still signing in, but I'm going to get us started. Welcome to our first event this spring semester. I am delighted to see so many of you here for what promises to be a great talk and conversation with our colleague, Dr. Joseph Winters. He's the Alexander F. Haymeyer Associate Professor of Religious Studies and African American Studies, with secondary appointments in our department, as well as in Gender, Sexuality, and Feminist Studies. Joe received his PhD from Princeton University in 2009, and at Duke he has taught numerous courses drawing on his interests in Black religious thought, African American literature, and critical theory, including two very popular courses cross-listed in the English department on Toni Morrison and History of Hip Hop. Joe is the author of Hope Draped in Black, Race, Melancholy, and the Agony of Progress, published in 2016 with Duke University Press. His current book project is Disturbing Profanity, Hip Hop, Black Aesthetics, and the Volatile Sacred, also under contract with Duke. Today's talk is entitled Recovering the Irrecoverable Blackness, Melancholy, and Duplicities That Bind. Joe, thank you very much for sharing your work with us today. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Karina. Can people hear me? Okay. Thank you so much, Karina, for inviting me. I want to thank the English department and everyone here. I want to thank Quante Holden for all that you do and everything that you did to get this together. I'm very excited about sharing this with everyone. So I think it's one way to kind of take up these 12 to 15 minutes is just talk a little bit about what I'm thinking about in this paper. It's a very strange paper, bringing together Spike Lee, Freud, Benjamin, and Morrison. So this is actually a draft for an essay that I recently submitted for a special issue. It's the journal is called Religions. It's an online journal. It's pretty. I think it's only like 4 or 5 years old. It's called Religions, and Miranda Simmons wanted to put together a special issue. It's called Slave Religion, right? Histories and Horizons. Essentially, what she's, the idea here is to take seriously much of the writing on slavery and the afterlife of slavery, I think in the last 10, 20 years, right? And how might, right, kind of rethinking the kind of afterlife of slavery generate new ways of talking about Black religion, right? Black subjectivity within religion, and getting beyond right notions of recovery, right? But I think one of the shift, it seems to me, right, in this special issue is from thinking about, slavery as some kind of clear object of study, to just thinking about it as maybe a starting point, right? the idea, I think it's like, okay, there's been all this work on the afterlife of slavery in the last couple of decades, really really rich work. How might this impact and influence what we do in religious studies? Right? So that's the kind of immediate context. As Karina pointed out, my first book, um, Hope Draped in Black, was trying to take very seriously two things. One is the ways in which I see Black studies, particularly kind of the literary aesthetic wing of Black studies, is always being invested in a kind of critique of triumphant notions of progress. Right? So on one hand, I'm reading people like Theodore Adorno, Walter Benjamin, and I'm also seeing in Du Bois, Ralph Ellison, Toni Morrison, Saidiya Hartman, also a kind of a critique of not only the ways in which progressive notions of history have been involved in justifying the rank ordering of peoples, right, but also the ways in which, to use Benjamin's language, triumphant notions of progress, can repeatedly kill the dead, right, through either a kind of forgetfulness, or turning legacies of suffering, instrumentalizing legacies of suffering, for kind of triumphant narratives. Right? So in the book, I kind of start with Freud's Morning Melancholy, because kind of like if you have melancholy in your title, you kind of got to start there, right? But I don't think that I did enough thinking about, I think, the complexities of that essay in the book. So here's me trying to do something with that in this paper. So Black studies, in my view, cuts against certain kind of triumphant notions of progress. At the same time, it offers, the authors that I was looking at, I wanted to suggest, offer a notion, of hope that's mediated and informed by melancholy, sorrow, and a recalcitrant notion of the tragic. So in some way, separating hope from optimism, and informing hope with a sense of the melancholic. So that was 2016. So since I've been at Duke, I feel like I've been in multiple conversations about melancholy. Right. One conversation is with a recent graduate here, Israel Durham. I know he likes to go by I Augustus Durham, right? But one conversation with Israel. His project is looking at the relationship between melancholy and genius, right? So what was interesting to me is, I mean, he's thinking in, I think, much more rich and complicated ways about melancholy, but also thinking about the ways in which melancholy has been associated with the four humors. If you read Aristotle in that tradition, right? It's been associated with black bile, right? And so, but melancholy is not just a kind of sadness, right? In those traditions, right? It also is associated with a kind of creativity, right? And a kind of genius, right? So he's trying to bring together, trying to think melancholy beyond some kind of just I guess devastating notion of despair, right? So there's that conversation. Another conversation I've been part of is with, I guess, an emerging discourse of Afro-Pessimism, right? And so I was struck by a line in Frank Wilderson's book, uh, Red, White, and Black, his book on cinema, right, where he says the black is a figure or a subject position that has nothing to lose, right? So there's a sense in which, as he's comparing, the kind of violence, that constitutes the relationship between the human and the black. He wants to say as other subject positions within modernity have something concrete to lose, like maybe land or sovereignty, right? There's something about the black, Wilderson wants to say, where, that has nothing to lose. So insofar as melancholy is usually associated with a kind of loss, it made me think, okay, well, maybe I've got to think about, how loss is operating, right? How loss is operating in my use of melancholy, right? And I maybe have to be a little more rigorous with how I'm thinking about the relationship between melancholy, loss, and melancholy, and something like more constitutive lack. Um, that's the kind of, those are the two discourses that I've been part of the last couple years. And then a couple years ago, Stephen Best's book None Like Us, is released. It's one of the essays in that book, on making the past present, actually was an essay that, in response to the work of people like Saidiya Hartman, Ian Balcom, Toni Morrison. The basic idea here is that I think there's a concern that Black studies, at least in the last 20 years or so, has been kind of inspired by kind of what he calls melancholy historicism. Right, it's been for him animated by a kind of recovery project. Another term he uses is it's a kind of forensic imagination, right? Where Black studies is always returning to some original crime, right? Some collective crime, some collective trauma, and even as if there's a kind of double imperative, right? This notion of, right, recovering that which can't be recovered, or right, like a sense of impossibility, right, or trying to assign words to that which is undecipherable. He says that that betrays in some way. There's a kind of tacit, right, desire to recover some complete or some coherent we at the scene of the crime, right? And he associates that with a kind of melancholy historicism. He mentions Freud. He mentions Benjamin. And the people he's thinking about with the Black Study, he's thinking about Saidiya Hartman. He's thinking about Vincent Brown. He's thinking about Anne Cheng's book on melancholy. He's certainly thinking about Ian Balcom's book, Spectres of the Atlantic. And so I mean, I found it a very provocative text, right? But what I guess I'm trying to argue in this in here is by going back to melancholy, going back to Benjamin, who he thinks is behind a lot of the melancholy historicism, and going back to Freud, I want to suggest that there's more of a tension, right? So whereas he wants to get away from Black studies as being in recovery mode to something like Blackness as an impossibility, right? Blackness is constituted by a kind of negation. Right? Here he finds this in people like he finds this in James Baldwin. He finds this in David Walker in one of his speeches, right, where he says there's a kind of prayer where he's saying, right, where he associates, where he says Black people, there's been none like us. That's where he gets the title from. So he's trying to make this move from something like recovery, lineage, tradition to something like dissolution, right? And he mentions, right, I mean, queer theorists like right, Leo Bersani as helping him think through that. I want to suggest something like more of a doubleness here, right? Where there is something like an attachment, there is something like a search or a seeking, but the attachment is to something that's right, to something like a wound, something like ruination, right? So where attachment and dissolution, right, or something like recovery and impossibility, we don't have to see those things as being kind of in opposition to each other. Now, let's be clear. Best is brilliant. He's real. He already sees that move to some extent in the introduction, right? So he knows that when Morrison says this is not a story to pass on, or when Hartman in Venus in Two Acts talks about, right, says that this project is an impossibility, right? She basically says, right, what I'm trying to get at is a possibility of assigning words to that which can't be represented. He knows there's a kind of paradox there, but my sense is either one, he thinks that really what's behind that is a desire to recover this we, right? As I said, at the crime scene, to use his language. Or what he seems to be saying is Black studies seems to be stuck, right, kind of stuck in this pastness. And he wants to think, right, something like, right, to go from melancholy to something like mourning, right, where, right, not necessarily abandon, but we can kind of, right, redirect our attachments, right, from lost objects to new objects, in new possibilities, right. So, so anyway, so that I'm responding to that by saying that melancholy actually there's a kind of doubleness in melancholy. I think within Morrison's work, I think in Freud's work, and Benjamin's work, and that's what I'm trying to lay out here. Right? I don't know if he would buy it, but that's what I'm trying to lay out. So broader broader project here. This is not necessarily a book project. I've been fascinated, I think, for years about the kind of intersections between Black studies and psychoanalytic theory. Um, I've been terrified to read Lacan though, so maybe people can help me out with that. I've started reading some of the lectures. I'm trying to work through it. I feel much more comfortable with Freud and some of Irigaray work and George Bataille. But I'm very much interested in where psychoanalysis shows up in Spillers' work, where I think it's implicitly showing up in Toni Morrison's work, and certainly where I see it showing up in people like David Marriott and Frank Wilderson, Jared Sexton. So as many of you might know, within Afro-pessimism, there's this turn to think, to think at the intersection of political economy and libidinal economy. Um, and what I'm interested in is when Wilderson is talking about libidinal economy and how, right, hostility, identification, and this kind of ambivalence is both attraction and this kind of repulsion is structured and regulated by the broader social world, right? So he calls it, right? So we don't have to think of obviously, right, think of structures of feeling. We don't have to think of economy in opposition to something like affect and emotion. I'm also interested in is a set of conversations that I've been seeing on Twitter, which is becoming an archive right now, right? Where the kinds of critiques of Afro-pessimism, um, too abstract, ahistorical, it's not material enough, remind me of some of the critiques, kind of like Marxist-inspired critiques of a kind of psychoanalysis, particularly this, right, of psychoanalysis. So my hope is to teach a course on Black studies and psychoanalytic theory. I know that people here at Duke, I know Ranji has written about intersections of certainly race, coloniality, and psychoanalysis in her great book, Dark Continents. Antonio Viejo has written about these things in Dead Subjects. So I'm part of a brilliant tradition and legacy here. So I'm just trying to think through these intersections, right? That's the broader piece um, as far as a course, and that broader piece is also connected to this. Is the last thing, right? You might be asking, how is this religious studies? How is this? How does this connect to religious studies? For me, right, I've noticed, right, a interesting, but I think sometimes undeveloped, unexplored connection or set of affinities between how authors are describing blackness, um, and how certain authors talk about the sacred, right? And here I don't mean the sacred as like that which needs to be protected or a signifier for purity, but what George Bataille talks about is a kind of like volatile sacred. A sacred is that which disrupts, that which is excessive, that which kind of unravels our attachment to accumulation, to being a coherent subject, and so forth, right? So, part of a broader project is to take seriously, right, how within religious studies, right, thinking about the ambivalence of the sacred, thinking about, right, a sacred that disrupts, a sacred that is excessive, and thinking about the relationship between that and how authors are talking about blackness, the black feminine, and so forth. Right? So that's the kind of overarching project. In psychoanalysis, I think, in black studies have a part to play, and I think Stephen Best's book was an occasion for me to kind of work through some of these connections and some of these tensions. So I appreciate. I hope that made some sense. But I appreciate any feedback, criticisms, or just help for thinking about how to make this a more coherent project. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. We are going to open the conversation, and what I would like to ask you is to use the raise your hand function, and that way I can acknowledge you in the order in which you have raised your hand. That would make things easier if you use the raise your hand function as opposed to raising your hand like this, which I might not be able to see because of the number of participants. We always need a minute to wrap our thoughts around what you have just said, which was, of course, very rich. But since there aren't any questions yet, I will venture a first question, which is more of a remark. As I was reading your paper, I was really interested in how Best starts with or builds on Bataille, right? And Bataille's critique of a community, and um, I was wondering if you have an interest in thinking about this critique of a community that is founded on something shared in common, including something material, because Bataille is, of course, at the origin of the critique of community in continental philosophy, right? So Blanchot starts with Bataille, and then Jean-Luc Nancy engages in conversation with Blanchot and that whole discussion about the inoperative community, the unavowable community, and so on. So the whole critique of community over the course of the 20th century, mostly among readers of Heidegger, has been a critique of Gemeinschaft as something, right, which goes back to Tönnies, for example, as something that was never there in the first place, right? So you seem to have a similar line of argument here conducted through Black studies. And so I'm wondering if there is any way of, or if there is even an interest in putting these two critiques of community in conversation.
Yeah, thank you so much for the question, Karina. So part of that section where I introduced Bataille, should be careful that I should be probably more careful. So Best doesn't mention Bataille, right? But I noticed, so the person he, at least in the introduction, that he thinks with is Leo Bersani, right? And the kind of where something like, thinking about, it seems to me, I mean, he's trying to bring Black studies and kind of say maybe queer theory together in a certain kind of way, right? So he's interested in something like, right, self-shattering, right? Like this kind of, right, this queerness is a kind of signifier for a kind of self-shattering. But I guess for me, I mean, he starts Best begins the book by saying that, yeah, I mean, Black studies has a communitarianism problem, right? That there's always a kind of lingering sense of something like the common, right? A common trajectory, a common starting point. Um, so I guess I'm both interested in, right, and I'm thinking I've thought about, right, the kind of community to come, or inoperative community, these kinds of, but I'm interested in, certainly I'm interested in a kind of rupture in any notion of something like, right, some notion of an essence, or some notion of some kind of stable, right, some stable center around which the communities gather. But I'm still interested in gathering, right? I'm still interested in something like relation and sociality, right, in Black studies, right? But but a sense of sociality. Maybe that's the move, right? Right. But a sense of sociality that takes seriously dispersion, that takes seriously the break. If that makes any sense. That takes seriously the wound. Right? So when um, Hortense Spillers talks about Black culture as a kind of wound, as a kind of wounding, right? That for me, is both a kind of signifier of like something like a mark of pain, but also like something like an openness, but also a kind of fracturing, right? A kind of fracturing of any notion of a kind of some, like you said, like some kind of unified community that was never there, right? And I take it that Best's point is that the melancholy historicist, even if like even if they claim they're getting at the ruins, even if they claim they're getting at the unrepresentable, there's still in the background something like, right, something like a lost object, right? Something has been taken away, right? And even if that's not always rendered explicit, I think that's his point. And I'm wrestling with. So the shorter, I guess, answer is yes. I'm interested in those critiques, and I'm trying to get maybe, you know, from something like community, right, to something like sociality, right, which takes seriously dispersion and gathering, takes seriously the wound and these kinds of things.
Thank you, Joe. We seem to have some questions here related to how to use the raise your hand function. So if you have not been able to locate it, it's under reactions. Yeah. All right. Thank you, Tom. So we have Ranji and then Rob who have questions.
Hi, Joe. Thanks for this. It's a very interesting paper, and uh, I haven't read Best's book, so so I may be missing. I may be missing. Well, clearly I'm missing a lot because I haven't read the book. But I wanted to try to tackle sort of some different strands of melancholy that you're articulating here. Um, the with Benjamin, of course, there's that idea of left melancholia, right? And Wendy Brown has also taken that up, and as you know. And it does seem to me that that's sort of a strand of thinking that then ends up also in Paul Gilroy's work, right, the post-colonial melancholia book. It seems to me that that idea of melancholia is actually in some ways not that psychoanalytically technical, and in some ways it's sort of drawing on a longer history of melancholia, um, uh, um, and um, uh, so ends up sort of taking on a slightly different kind of vein. It seems to me that the kind of work that you see with Anne Cheng, also David Eng, to some extent David Kazandjian, although I think Kazandjian's work is slightly different in this regard, is an idea of melancholia that is really shaped by a Kleinian version of melancholia, right? So Melanie Klein's version of melancholy really goes on to shape Judith Butler's work, for example. So, but in The Psychic Life of Power, that idea of melancholy is really constitutive, right? It is about a constitutive lack. We all give up on our on a kind of inherent bisexuality, and to enter into into some kind of heterosexuality or homosexuality, right, for that matter, right? So there's a kind of loss that is identifiable there. But in Freud, the loss with melancholy is not really identifiable, and I think that to some extent, where that the I in some ways the work of psychoanalysis might be to try and find the lost object. In some ways, it's actually not really to find the lost object, but really to sort of deal with um, with um, with the symptom, as it were, the symptom of loss, right? So you may know something that you've lost, right? But you don't actually know what you may be conscious of the fact that you've lost something, right? But you don't actually know what aspect of it is that's lost. I and to some extent, the there's a different kind of Kleinian strain that ends up with Lacan, right? And that because Lacan is so indebted to Klein, and acknowledges that at some points and not at others, right? But really with the Lacanian model, really you have this idea of a constitutive lack that is basically about what happens when you come into being a subject, right? When so subjecthood is about it always involves. That's why people like Gigi say, all this crap about melancholia, and so all this stuff about melancholia is really misguided, because in fact it is lack itself, right? And so so then I suppose the critique ends up being, and I think that this is something that you were referring to in your in your earlier comments, is that to some extent any kind of acknowledgement of content to a history, to a material history, becomes an object of suspicion, right? Do you see what I mean by that? It's almost as if it's actually not so much the affect that is associated with that, or indeed the reconstruction of that content, but it is content itself that becomes the object of suspicion, right? And sometimes sometimes that may be articulated in terms of what was once unconscious is now conscious, or it may be articulated as what was once buried is now unconcealed, if you like, within a different kind of Heideggerian vein, if you like. But I think that I think that what ends up happening to some extent with that suspicion of content is that there's a sort of leveling, if you see what I mean. So any kind of lack can be attributed to this constitutive lack, right? And what happens then in social theory, unlike in the analytic situation, as it were, is that anything that is a generalizable material lack, right, becomes an object of suspicion. Of course, in the clinical setting, it doesn't, because you're always dealing with a particular person's symptoms, right? And it's all about individuation, so it functions differently, right? But when it comes to social theory, there is this kind of equivalent that's set up. So then the question ends up being, and what I mean, I in a sense take this to be your point. So partly this is a very long way of asking you if I've got you right. Is that if it is the case that that we are going to be able to distinguish historically the different ways in which loss is manifested, or indeed the ways in which an idea of the human is constituted. um, 1 minute. Even if we have an idea of loss that is is um, is shaped by an idea of the human, even if we don't think that we can attain that humanness, as it were, right? Then then there's then then we're going to have to do the work of content, right? We're going to have to do the work of understanding what it is in the content of idea of the human, or an idea of the Black in relation to the human, for example, um, to understand where the rub is, right? Because it seems to me that you're invested in where the rub is there, right? And in a sense, Best is, it sounds as if he's moving to that Leo Bersani model of the death drive, which I think is a very compelling argument, but actually they're not really taking into account what it means to use a model that was really developed around the idea of queerness, and death-driven, death-defined idea of sex, right, into the realm of Black studies, right? When in fact, that metaphorical gesture, which is always so important in psychoanalysis, would demand that one investigated that, right? How the metaphor is functioning, as it were.
So yeah, this is a thank you, Ranji. This is I think so. There's a lot in there that was very. I mean, just trying to kind of make sure that I'm the one point about the different strands of melancholia, right, and also the different strands of psychoanalysis, right. So one thing that I'm very interested in is, can point me in the direction. I actually just ordered some of Melanie Klein's work. These these 3 volumes of her, right. But what was interesting to me is I'm finding in certain conversations, people are kind of returning to Melanie Klein. Whether it's Bonnie Honig, right? People who are trying to, I mean, people think that there's been too much emphasis on a Freudian understanding of melancholy, whereas Klein gives you not only a sense of the partial object and object relations, but the possibility of repair, right? But a notion of repair that's not about making whole necessarily, but so I'm very much interested in thinking about Klein. I think I'm also interested in this notion of content, right? Because exactly right. I mean, it's like when you're talking individually about, okay, right, something like a constitutive lack. You're talking about a constitutive lack that is right, that is the condition of subject formation, right? That's one thing. Another thing, and this is I think what Bess is probably worried about. Even if we were to say, okay, I'm talking about a constitutive loss or something like that, right? If that becomes leveling, then it's almost as if, I think what he's worried about is almost as if like you've always got to go back to this moment, this original crime scene, right? This original crime scene is a way to make sense of different forms of loss that Black people experience. I think that's right. So so there is a kind, like you said, there is a kind of leveling, and I think that for him, at least within a certain tradition of psychoanalysis, there's something about mourning, right? Right. There's something about mourning over melancholia, right, that allows for you to acknowledge loss. I don't want to say move on in some like, but at least acknowledge loss, but also invest in other kinds of objects, right? Even if one of that investment is a kind of right, is a kind of projects that artworks that allow for a kind of self negation or something like that. And I think this is a question. I mean, I think what I'm trying to think through is, and I'll just say this, and I know there's a lot of other questions, but I'm trying to think, at least with Freud's essay, it seems to me, right, that you have to that even Freud suggests is that one has to think both with mourning and melancholia and beyond the opposition, right? And I say that because there's something about mourning. I agree with people who say that there's something about mourning that makes it seem too teleological, right? Like it's like, you have one. I mean, at least in that essay, not necessarily later on, but right where but there's also something about melancholy that also seems also problematic. That also can't take loss as loss because of the incorporation and stuff. If I'm making it, I'm trying to think of some place that takes both mourning and melancholy, right? but also is somewhat beyond, but also thinks beyond that. And what I've suggested elsewhere is I've looked to sorrow, I looked to sorrow and the spirituals. I've looked to literary jazz and blues to do some of that work. But I hope that's some response to your question. But thank you for your comment.
Thank you. Rob?
Thank you so much, Joe, for the paper and for participating in this. And I have to say, I loved reading the paper. It was, to my eyes, at least, this incredibly productive combination and connection of pretty sophisticated and deep theory on the one hand, that were then tied to these great readings of film and novels, and that's hard to do. And I mean, there's a lot more. The theory is the primary part, I think, of the paper, but yet the readings of Spike Lee's School Days at the start, and the very even briefer reading of Morrison's Beloved at the end are really productive. I mean, you do a lot in just a few words, and I'll say as the background for my question that Charlotte Sussman and I co-taught a course this fall, last semester, that was intended to survey literary theory or literary criticism in the 20th century for people who are just entering our graduate program. And we had some psychoanalysis, and Charlotte had encouraged me or us to have Morning Melancholy, and for some reason we didn't end up having it, and that was clearly an error there on my part. And so, as I was reading your paper, I was also thinking about this course in which we were looking at. We weren't trying to survey all of 20th century literary criticism, but what we thought of as those theoretical movements that have been most important for our contemporary moment. And so it's really interesting for me to read your essay there in respect to that as well. So the question I have is about a term that may not be one that that you invest in a lot, but it's the term double bind. And I have always found this term and this concept incredibly productive, probably as much for personal reasons as for professional reasons, just because I think it explains so often why one suffers. But I associate that term with like Gregory Bateson and cybernetics, and this notion essentially that you're getting two contradictory imperatives, and you're being asked to fulfill them both at once, and you can't. And Bateson was interested both with that in the case of humans, but also animals, as it turns out. And I don't know if that's where you're drawing that term from, but I just was interested in the term and any reflections you have on how you're thinking about that, and what work it does for you.
Thank you, Rob. Thank you so much. So the double bind. So part of the double bind comes from, I mean, thinking. I mean, I get something like this in some of the kind of. I mean, some of Derrida's work, and like, I mean, around the Messianic, right? Like you got to try to anticipate that which you can't anticipate, or something like that, right? But I get it. I think where I situate myself on that is in the end of Morrison's Beloved, right? So there's something about this is not a story to pass on, right? Which on one hand is like, I can imagine, some Stephen Best being like, do we have to do this again? I mean, like, because everybody talks about, right? But I mean, when I keep going back to it, each repeated time I read it differently. I experience it differently. But there is this something about, I mean, not a story to pass on, right? I take it that I also get in Saidiya Hartman's work as well. I mean, that there is, I mean, I take it that for them, there's almost a kind of ethical imperative. This is also something that Stephen Best pushes back against, right? He's like, why do we assume that we have this ethical relationship to history? Right? That's one of the things he's just questioning, like, why do we assume that? But a kind of ethical imperative of like, right, assigning words, not glossing over, so it's not a story to pass on, not glossing over, right? Whether it's missed opportunities, right, catastrophes, right? I mean, he talks, Hartman talks about cries and shrieks in the archive. Best talks about rumors in the archive, right? Those things that are difficult to pin down, and maybe we can never, right? Maybe we can never really represent them, but there's still a kind of call, right? So so it seems to me that the double is the call to be attuned to it, right? To try to find some words, right? But also to acknowledge, to use Morrison's language, to acknowledge when language has to get out of the way, right? So to acknowledge, right, that there's actually something that's in excess of it. Right? I don't know if it's, but so for me, there is a kind of, maybe this is my religious studies, but there's a kind of ethical, right? There is a kind of ethical for me. There is a kind of ethical relationship, right, to the archive and to history, right? Right, because I mean, we don't. I mean, forgetfulness or glossing over it, like that's not something, right? That's not. That's not. But also, like the ways in which, right, not dealing with the ways in which certain kinds of right events, legacies, disrupt and unravel, right, our familiar categories and frameworks of meaning. That's also something we have to be attuned to too. But I don't know. Yeah. So that's kind of what I've been thinking about when I talk about like the double bind. And I wonder, next to be a question for you and others, the language of binding. I don't know. Maybe I should. I mean, is it a bind or is it? But it also is an opening too. It also opens up to something. And that's what I'm. Yeah. So yeah. But that's what.
Thank you, Sarah. Sarah, could you please unmute yourself? Thank you.
Yes, good idea. I have a comment and a question for Joe, but just following up this strand of conversation between Rob and Joe. Back in the day, R.D. Laing used the language of double bind to talk about the production of schizophrenia, that it was schizophrenogenetic or whatever the technical term is. But a bind is a bond as well. So the bond isn't anyway. We that's a longer conversation. Actually, I had a little comment that I was really curious, Joe, and thank you for the paper. It was lovely. You talked in your talk rather than in your paper about ruin and ruination, and it recalled back to my mind a set of essays I read quite a long time ago, but I remember them quite well. There's an architectural historian called Robert Harbison, and he wrote a book called The Built, the Unbuilt, and the Unbuildable. And he has this really brilliant chapter on ruins that really struck me. I was thinking about ruins for a different project. And he says something like, ruins provide us with ancestors and not descendants. And that phrase, I was remembering it in the refrain of the Toni Morrison that you're using, that this is not a story to pass on. And it strikes me that architectural image of ruin that Harbison conjures, creates a problem if you're thinking about the ruin as a noun or in fact as a literal place of memory. And so I was curious about whether you, in your own use of ruin, and you use the term both ruin and ruination, is ruin a noun? Is ruin a verb? I'd love to just, hear a little bit more on that and the sort of difference that this vocabulary might make to the picture you're building.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. This is I've really got to think about this ancestor descendant, because that's something. Right? If ruins, produce ancestors, not necessarily descendants, Best is assuming a kind of continuity, right? I mean, he's worried about that continuity, and right, that one is kind of recovering. One is also about a kind of projecting a kind of maybe straight linear time towards the future. So I'm thinking about. I mean, I've always been kind of fascinated with the language of remains, right? Which David, as Raji pointed out, like David Egg and David Kazanjian in their book on loss. So instead of just thinking about lost object or present or the presence of the object, why don't we? What if melancholy is a response to something like remains, right? The remains. So there's something about like when you think of like what remains, like the scraps, the ruins. So for me, it's a way for me to think, right? Not necessarily the whole object, right? Mm-hmm. But something that both something that's I'm not trying to about being too abstract, right? But the remain, in some sense, right? It's the very form, right? Fragmented, ruined, and so forth, right? That there's something about that both. I'm trying to think of what I'm right. It to some extent, right? It's very form, right? both I'm sorry, right? It both reminds us of, right, the violence of history, right? The violence has been done to it, but it also seems to me, right, it refuses a certain logic of incorporation, right? It refuses the logic of a kind of coherent meaning, right? So I guess the rule for me is both, right? Well, I always would much rather the verb anyway, right? But it is a kind of, right? It is a kind of, right? It is a kind of, I guess, insofar as the ruin would have to be in some kind of relationship, right, to that which produces ruins, right? But also the kinds of narratives that are trying to turn those ruins into something that would either erase them or turn them into something whole, right? Something coherent, right? So I guess it would have to be something like, I mean, for me, an ongoing movement. So I'd want to think in terms of the verb more than the noun, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you.
Thank you. Tom, please.
Hi, Corinna. Hi, Joe. So you already know that Rob's description of your essay is right on, and that I love the school days framing. It nails stuff. I think Lee would. All right. So having done the part where I do the affirmation, now I'll do the warning, and I'll do it quickly, which is that I think critical studies in general, and maybe even African American studies, is too damn invested in post-structuralist rumination on the excess but I don't want to pick an abstract fight. In fact, I want to invite you, and at the end of your response to Rob, you gestured, but 3 or 4 paragraphs before the end of this, squeezed between Ben Hameen and Anne Chang, is a comment about Morrison's investment in spirituals, jazz, and the blues. In long established forms, with unmistakably, for all its other syncretic contributions, unmistakably African American sensibility before, or at the very same time as we had our first thinkers, our first abstractors. So I just like to invite you to pull an example out of your hat. And show us the way in any of the musical forms, individual song, individual performer, a strain within it that is important to you, and that gets back in my face for thinking that I can move you into a double-binded mourning rather than a double-binded melancholia or something on that order. Of course, I want to do melancholia and mourning together, but then I'm going to sound like you, and that's not going to get us anywhere. At least it won't be as fun.
Right.
Remember, the sentence says that the sorrow and the melancholy are inseparable from joy, laughter, and dance. Things for which African Americans have been incommensurably better than most of the human beings in history. He says.
So, so thank you so much for the comments. Thank you, and I would love to talk to you more about like the investment in excess and so one I'll maybe go to an author first, and then we can think about maybe some a track.
Okay, whatever works.
One author, I mean, is actually Ralph Ellison's definition of the blues, or description of the blues. So in his essay Richard Wright's Blues, which is in Shadow and Axe, he basically says that blues is an impulse to keep the painful details of existence in one's aching consciousness, while at the same time, he says, touching its jagged edge, right, and taking a tragic comic lyricism from it. Right? I'm not good at memorizing too many, but this one always stays with me, right? So what's always interesting to me, right, about that is the way that he's talking about, the keeping those painful details, right, but simultaneously, right, the staying with is for him connected to something like a lyricism, right, tragic comic lyricism, and the poetic, dance, right, laughter. I mean, he has that essay, Extravagance of Laughter, which again, excess and laughter, we can talk, right? But there's a kind of, right, for Ellison, right, it's the simultaneity of it, right? I see something similar in Du Bois as well, right? So when Du Bois is talking about, right, motherless child, or right, come down Moses, or, I mean, what he's saying, like, right, that these songs, which you hear in these songs, are death and disappointment, right? And here he's responding to, in the early 20th century, he's responding to those who would say, well, the slave was pretty, right, happy and jovial and so forth, right? But right after he goes through and talks about the death and disappointment, he says, right, well, there's a, right, that there's a kind of hope that's breathed through it, right? There's a kind of sigh of hope, right, a breath of hope, even, right? It's almost like anticipating in some way Eshon Crawley's work, but there's a kind of breath of hope, right, that one can hear, right, that one can hear through it, right? So for me, I agree with you. For me, but I also see this in Benjamin too. I see in Benjamin, right, that the melancholy is also a kind of openness to the possibility of a kind of break and interruption. But that's right. So what I was trying to do in that moment is to say, I've talked a lot about melancholy here in this paper, but I don't want to suggest that, right, that I think sometimes it seems to me that Best is suggesting that, right, that the kind of melancholy historicism doesn't have room for anything else except a kind of, right, like a kind of fixation on the past, right? And I would want to suggest that no, I mean, if we, and again, he might say, well, this is, you're not talking about melancholy at that moment, you're talking about sorrow, you're talking about the blue. But I would want to suggest that there's certain strands and traditions of melancholy that actually do make room for other kinds of dispositions and attachments and affects. But I don't know if that's what you were.
Yeah, well, you moved it a little back toward the abstract, because we went through Ellison, and then you said anticipating. I would say, well, what Ellison is anticipating is his friend Albert Murray's
Right.
take on what is at stake in Stompin' the Blues,
Right.
which is something other than a bad imagery from Black minstrelsy.
Right.
But rather the Saturday night function,
Right.
And the way it allows community to take place and move forward, and
Right.
all those things. I find myself at the age of 64 romantic about.
Okay. Yeah.
Without being, a realist romanticism or
Right.
something, understanding the cost,
Right.
but wanting to do the political and effective and social and indeed aesthetic labor, even as the last category, because I don't think you can untwine them. That they all, moving in a sense forward without having to embrace, a Protestant line of progress or an American line of manifest African American destiny, or a diasporic line. Anyway, I'll be quiet.
No, that's sweet. No, thank you.
But I love this stuff. This is great. I wish Jay was here to help us.
Thank you. Jarvis tells me in the chat that he has a question, and then I'll also read Cici's question from the chat. Jarvis, please go ahead.
Sure. Hey, Joe, great to see you, man. Great to read your work. I sort of echo Rob and Tom. It was beautifully written, and I really enjoyed learning from you. I wanted to, I guess it seems like the right time to bring this up, but as I kept reading about or coming back to the wound, your mention of the wound, I just kept coming back to our dear colleague Nate Mackey's notion of wounded kinship, and because Nate is one of our sort of chief theorists, of someone who's thinking at the intersections of sound and literature and music, and because it seems that you've articulated that you see sort of models for the kind of paradox for the paradox that you are attempting to name, right? That there are these sort of other strands of melancholy that are not just about the past. That you see sort of models for that in music. I was just curious if you see if some of Mackey's critical language and lexicon can actually be useful. I'm thinking about terms like like I said, like wounded kinship. It was reminding me of the phrase or the term that you use in the piece that you shared with us, the Bataille. I believe you described it as wounded communion. And I was wondering, and what Mackey says about wounded kinship is that that music is wounded kinship's last resort, right? So I was curious if
Yeah.
that might be a useful term for you, but also the notion of the duende that he's borrowing from Lorca also seems really useful. That kind of singing at the edge of one's voice, right? That suggests that the voice is breaking, but it's also a space of possibility, right, as well. And it seems to me, and perhaps even the notion of the phantom limb. I mean, I'd have to kind of return to,
Yeah.
you know, the Mackey.
Yeah.
To those works to really sit with them with each term, but it certainly seems like he gives us as someone who's thinking at the intersections of literature and music and
Yeah.
sound and performance, he really does provide some language that could be useful for grappling with this effort to both um, uh, what you're suggesting, the kind of sort of multivalence
Yeah.
of
Yeah. Yeah.
particularly for melancholy, particularly duende, but as you're thinking about sort of the wound and communion, wounded kinship seems useful as well. So.
Yeah. No, thank you so much, Jarvis. Yes, I'm almost ashamed to say that I have not read enough of Naki's work, but that sounds yeah. I mean that's very it sounds like what I'm trying to get at, right? I mean, like something like right because I don't yeah because I mean I don't want I mean this is maybe where I don't want to maybe I don't want to go all the way with like the death drive, right? Maybe I mean like there's something that's for me there's something to me right that is I'm very convinced by some of many of the critiques of a kind of like communitarianism, right? But wounded kinship it says something. I mean the wounded what is the qualifier doing there, right? So the wounded there, then we have to maybe both think about the way in which the wound is operating in multiple ways, but also it seems what you're getting at is now we have to understand kinship in a different way, right? Maybe even kinship beyond like blood, kinship beyond right, like kinship beyond just thinking in terms of similarity or right. It's if there are connections and affinities, there are also tensions and hostilities and right. And so I think and pain, right? And so I think that's for me. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I'm going to go, I'm this idea of the breaking voice. Um, I think is something that I'm very interested in. Where you said singing is like the last resort, right? Singing is the last. I'm interested in thinking about the kind of the cry. I mean, I'm about to teach this hip hop course this semester, right? But how particularly the cry, right, gets incorporated into hip hop as a sample, right? That's sometimes buried below the layers of things, right? But there is, but there's something about the cry, about the cracked voice, right? That I actually hear like throughout hip hop and the sampling of like old soul. But I also hear actually in auto tune as well, right? I also hear it in auto tune, particularly in rappers like Future, right? So I hear it kind of like so even though the content's not always that interesting, right? Like there's something about the sound of the cry, right? It's something that's breaking up, something that's like something that's it's in the break it's there's an ambiguous space that's like yeah there's something painful here but there's also like you said an opening to some kind of possibility in a sense of being at the edge in a certain way so thank you for that that's the kind of stuff and I think what I'm also hearing you say is maybe just implicitly is to be mindful of the range of resources right the range of resources particularly within Black studies right to think about these you know that in some way turn what might be paradoxes in one situation into something is something else, right? Some more of a posit relationship or something like that, right? Right. So, but anyway, thank you so much.
Thank you. So Tsitsi formulated a question and she posted it in the chat, and I will go ahead and ask and read it because she has had to step out, unfortunately. But I think it's very interesting and we'd really benefit from hearing you talk about this. So I'll go ahead and read. Stephen Best makes many of his claims in the name of engaging aesthetics more robustly. Would you reflect a bit on this turn to the aesthetic in Black studies? And she says Philip Harper's abstractionist aesthetics also comes to mind. Joe, you're muted. Could you please unmute yourself?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. So great. So one of the things, and this is something that I'm beginning to kind of think through, and I know others here can help and see yourself. I'm very much interested in well. I'm interested in, well, I'm interested in the aesthetic turn. I'm interested in like particularly a kind of poetic turn, but I'm also interested in the language of turn too, right? Because at times it's almost like, and I know that Cece knows this, but like at times, right, we think of turn as like, it's a kind of shift to something new, right? Whereas I'm wondering if it's like what's really happening is just kind of a kind of right, either making explicit, right, or placing a more emphasis, more concentration on the kind of the kind of relationship between aesthetics. I think aesthetics, politics, and ethics that I think have always been kind of part of Black, not always, but I think has certainly been enough a part of Black studies to say that it's actually more of more constitutive than it is like an aberration or something like that. Right. So when I think of again when I think of like aesthetics, right, I'm thinking of in one like the production, right? I mean, Paul Taylor has an interesting definition of this, but like, we can think about this in terms of the production of Black art, but also the critique, right? The production, the critique, the preservation, right, of Black artwork, right, across the diaspora, right? But there's also something about aesthetics that I'm interested in, right, in terms of like, right, affect and sensibility, right? So a kind of tradition that thinks of like how, right, our relationship to the world, how, right, our attunement to the world, how we, feel, hear, see, how that is structured and organized, right, by, right, the configurations of power, and how might it be that, right, the aesthetic, right, in a poem or a song or literature, right, might open up, right, otherwise ways of actually experiencing the world. Right? So this for me connects to, right, Frankfurt School on the sensorium, right, structures of feeling, and someone like Raymond Williams, and I think also libidinal economy, right. But I'm trying to take very seriously, right, how I see a lot different authors going to, right, even someone like Denise da Silva, right, going to the poetic, right, going to novels, going to speculative fiction, as not as actually, right, making, right, not just not just kind of critical claims, right, about, right, the violent ways in which the social world is organized, but actually providing ways, right, to think otherwise, to think differently, right, not just about particular things, but to think differently about the ways in which we imagine, right, the way in which we imagine the broader world, right. So whether it has to do with, right, certain kinds of binaries and demarcations, um, the relationship between self-other, the relationship between the human and the non-human, and I take it that someone like, anyway, I take it that the aesthetic, and I take it that someone like Denise da Silva, who I've been thinking a lot about these things with, when she coins the term poethical, right, she's trying to take seriously the relationship between, right, ethics, right, and aesthetics, ethics and a kind of poetic, right, not just right poetry, but also poetic is the possibility of creating, right, the possibility of inventing through words, through affects, through through writing and so forth, right. And I take it that I know I'm just repeating myself. I'm trying to get because I'm trying to take seriously, right, not only the ways in which you're seeing, I mean, authors concentrate on and underscore how the aesthetic is this kind of these set of resources, right, for radically reimagining the world, but they're also getting us to think about the ways in which this is always right. I mean, so it's important. For instance, I know I say this all the time, but the fact that Du Bois, the fact that Du Bois ends Souls of Black Folk on the Sorrow Songs, right? Even though he was supposed, he didn't really want to end there, but it was an editorial issue, right? He actually wanted to end with the coming of John, right? Which would have been its own thing. But the fact that he would have ended with a short story, right, or the fact that Du Bois always said that the text that everybody bashes, but said was the most important text was Dark Princess, right, which was a novel, right. And so I guess what I'm suggesting here is that the aesthetic, or aesthetics or the poetic or the multi-genred quality of Black studies for me has always been something, right, that has been present. I think that has been very salient. And maybe what we're seeing now in the last, 10, 20 years is maybe a more kind of, sustained, a more kind of, sustained, unabashed, right, kind of willingness to wrestle with that legacy.
Ranchi, do you want to make the comment orally that you posted in the chat, maybe, since we still have a few minutes left?
I'm happy to if no one else wants to ask a question right now. I was just saying that it seems that Best's investment in surface reading is goes along with this anxiety around the lost object that is sort of buried below or whatever, buried beneath, and the claim to aesthetics that goes that's there in the surface reading language, which I think basically it sort of exaggerates the novelty of the investment in aesthetics, to my mind. So to some extent, I feel as if that there is a coming together of this disavowal of the lost object and the claim to aesthetic investment that have to be paired, when in fact it seems like, I don't know, certainly with Saidiya Hartman, some of the other people he's citing as well, certainly Toni Morrison, right? One wouldn't necessarily buy that argument.
So can you say, I mean, because it seems to me, right? I mean, like you're saying, like, I mean, there seems to be this kind of surface depth thing, right, in his right, which is certainly, I mean, I guess maybe stereotypically, like, psychoanalysis has been associated with the depth, right, with something like depth or something like that. But I mean, it does seem to me that, I mean, it seems to me. I mean, we're thinking about. I mean, this is maybe more of a question than a response, but I'm wondering. I tend to respond to, surface depth, or attachment versus letting go, right? Those kinds of oppositions, with saying, like, well, what about the both and, right? What about the both and? But I'm wondering, I guess it was just maybe a question. I mean, are there times when actually we should be invested in either or? Should we be invested in something like an either or, right? For both, maybe both to be, kind of faithful to whatever we're diagnosing, right? Or to a certain kind of political, to certain kind of political possibilities. Right? Because I say this because I tend to, side on the kind of both and. So there's I mean, Marla, you can get this in like phenomena, like there's depth at the surface, right, in the relationships at the surface or something like that, or you can have mourning and melancholy, but it does seem to me certain strands of thought, particularly Afro-pessimism, right? Like, no, like the human in the black for Wilderson it can't be a both and, right? Right? There's a moment here, almost a kind of, anyway. This is just my own. This might make no sense to people, but there is something in my mind where I go towards the more of the both and ambiguity and simultaneity, but trying to take seriously moments where actually, our diagnoses should actually be committed to something like, an either or maybe some kind of, like, not either or, but maybe some kind of strong opposition, right? I don't know, people. I don't know if that makes sense. That resonates.
It looks like Rob's about to say something. No? Oh, okay. You were just leaning into the screen. Okay, sorry. Well, I mean, I think that it's an interesting question. I mean, I think that there are times with a certain vein of Marxist critique, I think you would have to say that absolutely one would have to understand the base structure, right? I mean, I think so but that will only manifest in the superstructure, and to some extent, I mean, I think that there's the idea of surface is resistant there to acknowledging that that in a sense the base is only manifest in the superstructure. It's the same as and in that kind of if you sort of grind it down to its basics, if you like, you have that idea of the latent and the manifest also, right? In in psychoanalysis, dream interpretation, or even say in the way in which someone like Said, who one would, no one would say that he was not an aesthete, right?
Right. Yeah.
Uses the idea of the latent and manifest in Orientalism, right? So, it seems to me that with much of the work that I've read anyway in the surface reading apparatus, there is an exaggerated claim to the inattention to the manifest in favor of the latent, that causes an evasion of the aesthetic. And I mean, I just don't buy it. It's just, I don't think that there is really evidence for that. So, is there a political imperative? I'm very much within the realm of thinking around the ethico-political that I've thought through Derrida, as well as I know you have, that I think he's thought through Abraham and Torok for his own thinking around mid-morning, which is somewhere between melancholia and morning. So in that regard, of course, we all have to make decisions, right, that are about often about the latent, what we understand to be the latent, the bottom line, right? But they only make sense and manifest in the realm of in the realm of in a kind of superstructural realm, if you like.
Thank you. I don't see other raised hands, so I assume that there aren't, for now at least, any other questions. I want to thank Joe once again for sharing his work with us. I feel we've all learned a lot this afternoon, both from reading the paper, which was, as everybody said, fabulous, and from the exchanges that ensued. So thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much. Appreciate this. Thank you.
I just want to say that we will have other related events in the department this semester. I want to congratulate the Vast Connections team for organizing what promises to be a really fabulous series of talks. And I hope to see many of you there on January 29th and then on January 30th. And I assume everybody has received information about them. And then we will have, again this year, Carol Phillips as a writer visiting us virtually, unfortunately only, but still I think the community will benefit immensely from his presence again. And of course, this afternoon, I'm sure I'll see many of you at the job doc at 3:30. So thank you all. I wish you a healthy and productive semester. Goodbye.